And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and in this video, I will be talking about my newest Commander deck, but there's a whole bunch I got to talk about in this video first. So as I've been hinting at in a lot of my videos recently, I will be talking about my personal decks video. And in fact, that's the next video coming up. I mean, next week probably. And I realized there was so much to talk about in that video that I want to do some videos leading up to it. Mainly because I have really changed the way that I build decks, as I talked about in the last video about it. If you haven't checked that out, there's a few videos. You sort of have to watch them all in order to understand everything that's going on here. That's why I'm doing them in a series like this. I just talked about how I've changed my deck building style, and that you will see here with my latest deck. You also saw it in the deck I talked about in that video, the Planar Priest deck. And of course, the big topic there was the whole Monolith Commanders thing, which I talked about in my Monolith Commanders video, which I did before that, right? It all sort of plays into itself, how I am not only avoiding Monolith Commanders, but just in general, avoiding making decks for myself anymore where I absolutely need my commander in play, because it just really cramps my playing style and makes things a lot more difficult for me if my opponents have that removal ready to go, which they should. That being said, I'm going to start off this video by talking about the one deck that I took apart this last year, which is my Reign Academy Chancellor deck. And I had talked about this deck a few times on my channel last year. Obviously, I talked about it in my personal decks video, which I did last year. I do it every year. Again, coming up next week. That video, I ranked my decks on, my favorite to play down to my least favorite to play, and Reign was, I believe, right at the bottom. It was a deck that I wasn't enjoying a whole ton. And funny enough, the other decks I had towards the bottom, I had my Shanna deck, which was thinking of taking apart, and I also had my Gerard deck, which I was thinking of taking apart. All three of those decks at the bottom, I completely revamped. I made a video about that as well. The other two, I am in love with. Mission accomplished. I absolutely love playing those decks. My Reign deck, despite the fact that I made some major changes to it, and the first game I played with it after the changes, I actually ended up winning. I still took the deck apart because it is, and again, I didn't even realize I was doing it, but it is very much, it was by far my most monolith commander deck. It was the deck that I absolutely, and I noticed it entirely with the last time I was playing that deck, that I'm just sitting here doing literal nothing. This is the perfect example of it, right? I'm sitting here doing literal nothing until not only do I get my commander out, but I want to get an aura on it as well, right? I want it to be enchanted with something. And after that is accomplished, then now I can start doing stuff. And man, I just didn't like it at all. And there was so many games where, yeah, there was games where, man, my deck's just going off and everything's working the way I want. I got my spell skite out. Everything's great. But that was like 1 out of every 5 that would happen. Most games, I was spending a whole lot of time just trying to get my commander out. I had to protect it because as soon as someone killed it, it goes to the graveyard. Sure, I get a couple card draw off of it, but then I got to recast my commander, get an aura on it again. It wasn't working out great. And the reason why is because it was a monolith build. I built that deck so that not only did I need Reign in play, but I needed an enchantment on it as well in order for it to work well. I'm not doing decks like that anymore. I do have decks currently that, yeah, they're very much built around my commander, but that was the worst case for that scenario. Part of the reason why I took it apart, I also already have a mono blue deck. I don't need 2. And there's a lot of other mono blue commanders that I've been thinking about going after. I'll also quickly bring up my digital decks that I have talked about on my channel before. I will put those videos in the description if you haven't already watched them. They are decks that I likely will eventually put together in paper. So my Borborygmos deck, as I talked about, Borborygmos and Fibblethip, or Minion Carl is a little easier to say. My Minion Carl deck is a really fun, interesting deck. It's also the only 3-color deck that I currently have right now. I already talked about that in a video last year. It was currently my favorite deck to play at the time. I have not yet put it together in paper, although I likely will at some point. My AO deck also is a deck that I really like a lot. And it is a deck that hopefully eventually I will put it together in paper. Again, I already made a video about that if you want to go check out what all I'm doing in that deck. I still got it, the digital version, and hopefully someday in paper. Again, one of the issues specifically with that deck is I have Jeweled Lotus and I have Mox Opal, and I have a lot of really powerful, because that's what I'm doing in the deck. I'm doing the zero cost artifact thing in that deck. So all of those free, essentially, artifacts, as we all know, are really expensive. So that's just a really expensive deck. That's the reason why I haven't put it together in paper yet. Hopefully someday. The Planar Priest deck, which I already alluded to, which again, that's a not necessarily built around any commander. I talked about that in the last video. I think I might be switching to Sten. Originally I had Boromir. I think I'll be switching to Sten, probably. I swapped out a few cards. I like that build better, and I will eventually be putting that together in paper. My newest deck that I am putting together in paper. I am currently, and then literally I'm going to reach over here and grab the deck, because this is what I'm doing here. This is the deck right now, Pedantic Learning, you can see. Here's what I'm waiting on. These are empty sleeves. So that's what's currently, this is what I have so far, right? Like 80% of it or whatever. Still waiting for some cards to come in the mail. And then that will be my newest. So it literally is my brand newest deck put together in paper. By the time you're watching this video, it is likely I will fully have it together in paper. I will also like to point out that I haven't done a gameplay video in a little while. One of the reasons I like to do the gameplay videos on my channel is to put at least one game out there of me playing all of my decks. So hopefully that will be the case. I'm going to try to get all my decks, actually gameplay videos of all of them, on my channel at some point. Obviously, I got a bunch already. Eventually, hopefully, I will be able to get them all, this one included. So hopefully I can get a gameplay video out with this deck in the near future. But what is it doing, right? And that's what else I'm going to talk about, of course, in this video. I'm talking about my newest Commander deck. And just like I talked about in all these videos, again, that's why the lead up to this deck is not a monolith commander deck. And in fact, it's not entirely built around the commander at all. However, the commander is Dralnu Lich Lord, which is pretty important to the deck. And it's another commander that I think is just really fun and interesting. And for me, it's a commander that I kind of was already given a look at, which is one of the reasons why I end up sort of putting decks together for myself is, okay, I'm liking what I'm doing in the deck. Oh, and also I end up playing this commander that I've kind of always wanted to make a deck with. So all of that sort of fits into why I end up putting a deck together in paper. If you haven't seen it before, 3 blue and a black zombie wizard, 3/3. If damage would be dealt to Dralnu Lich Lord, sacrifice that many permanents instead. Oh boy, so your commander's immune to damage. That's good, right? I don't know if there's ever been anyone who built around that ability, like where you want to be sacrificing stuff, but yeah, it's a real bummer if someone casts a Blasphemous Act. That's just the game you're playing when you're playing this commander. I will point out that I do have March of Swirling Mist in the deck, just in case you phase out my commander and then I don't have to sacrifice my whole board. But you're just running that risk. There certainly is the scenario that my opponent casts a Blasphemous Act and I'm like, all right, good game, I guess, right? Because I would have to sack my whole board likely. But your commander does have a really, really powerful ability. Tap target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn. The flashback cost is equal to its mana cost. So just tap to give anything in your graveyard flashback. Instances, sorceries, obviously. Fantastic. Now, why did I choose this commander? And I will first point out that I did throw a couple of cards in here. You always should, just like I did with the Planar Priest deck. If I switch to Sten, I'm going to throw a couple cards in there that fit with Sten. And the cards that fit with Boromir, I'm going to take those out because obviously they don't do anything anymore. With Dralnu, I do have a couple of cards in here that I would say are very Dralnu. For example, Thousand Year Elixir. It's going to allow me to tap my commander right away, and then I can untap it, right? I would not put this in this deck if I swapped out commanders. Auric Lore Mage likely will fit in this deck no matter what, but it's extra good with Dralnu Lich Lord because this just becomes, go search your library for any instant and sorcery that you want to cast, and your Dralnu will then give it flashback so you can cast it. So it just becomes basically a tutor for your deck, but also works with everything else we're doing in the deck. And what we're doing in this deck is something I've wanted to do for a long, long time, and I play tested this deck an absolute ton. I talked about my Val deck. Again, a deck that I maybe fringe and considering I might put together in paper because it is very unique. And this deck as well is super unique in what it's doing. And it's why I ended up putting together in paper. My Val deck, I play tested it like crazy before considering putting together in paper, which I haven't. This deck probably is right in the same category of I've play tested it more than I've ever play tested a deck because of what it's doing is so unique and different than what I've ever done in a deck before. And again, I've talked about this on my channel a few times already, and I decided to do it myself, which is the same name thing. And in this case, it is Persistent Petitioners. Any card that is doing you can have any number of them in your deck. We just got Slime Against Humanity and Murders of Karlov, and I think that's like a $5 common already because everyone's going after that card because they want to do that thing. And again, if you're doing that deck, I will point out, try doing the same name thing. The same name thing is just a super unique strategy to do in the Commander format because, of course, typically those cards don't do anything, right? But in these very rare situations, like with Persistent Petitioners, you can do that. I talked about this in my last 5 unique builds video. And specifically with Persistent Petitioners, I toyed with a couple of different ones. I did the Shadowborn Apostles thing as well. I settled on Persistent Petitioners because with what I wanted, the other things I wanted to do in the deck worked with the milling strategy. And the milling strategy here, by the way, I'm milling myself. I'm not milling my opponents. That's why Dralnu works as a commander, right? I can sit there milling myself. I don't love self-mill, but all of the instants and sorceries that I mill into my graveyard, I can recast with my Dralnu if I want to. Great. So now if I mill that really important card I want, my Dralnu is now a recursion option for that card. The other reason why the self-mill works so well is because of the 2 cards that not built around, but certainly really important cards in the deck, which of course are instants and sorceries, so I can cast them with my commander. Echoing Return being one of them. 1 black mana sorcery, return target creature card, and all other cards with the same name as that card from your graveyard to your hand. So I'm milling, and of course I'm throwing lots of these Persistent Petitioners into my graveyard. I'll obviously have a ton in the deck. And then if I mill my Echoing Return, obviously I can recast it from my graveyard, fill my hand up with Persistent Petitioners. If I just have it in my hand, then obviously I can just cast it and then possibly recast it again with my commander. The other card that is in a very similar theme here is Secret Salvage. 3 black sorcery, exile target non-land card from your graveyard. Search your library for any number of cards with the same name and put them into your hand. So again, it's doing the same name thing, which typically is terrible in the commander format, except in this very unique scenario. And again, here, I don't want lots of them in my graveyard. I only need 1, but it works with the milling yourself and putting them into your graveyard. If I mill like 10, that's fine. I'll go search for the 20 or 30 more that I have in my library still, right? So that is the general mechanic of the deck. But then what do I do? Well, this is essentially a discard theme. There's 2 themes here. There's the self-mill theme and there's also the discard theme. I want things in my graveyard. I also kind of want things in my hand so that I can discard them. There's a lot of really neat interactions here. This is definitely a deck where I just kind of want to be setting up different things, but there is different things that I want to set up so that I'm not pigeonholing myself on one thing I need to be doing. A couple of things I can be doing in this deck. The big one is Sphinx of Chimes, and this is the card that I talked about in that 5 builds video, which has a really powerful effect. 4 blue, Sphinx 5/6 with flying. Discard 2 non-land cards with the same name, draw 4 cards. So the same name thing is mostly the build around here, right? The fact that I have however many Persistent Petitioners in my deck is just benefiting me mostly with that. Although again, I can tap 4 untapped advisors to mill 12 cards. Certainly I will be doing that, but mostly again, with the Echoing Return and the Secret Salvage, I just want to fill up my hand with those Persistent Petitioners so that I can then sort of go off with Sphinx of Chimes, discard 2 Persistent Petitioners, draw 4 cards. It is likely that I can repeat this process until I draw my entire deck. No, I do not have Labman or Thassa's Oracle in this deck, although I do have Psychosis Crawler, which of course is a way to win in this deck if I can just get into that sink of discarding 2, drawing 4. It's very easy to just kill everyone with that. I also have Archfiend of Ifnir, which now I'm in the discard, right? I'm doing both a whole bunch of discarding and a whole bunch of drawing. So both will work here, and Archfiend of Ifnir will very easily wipe out all of my opponent's creatures if I get into that scenario. Bone Miser is going to give me a giant army of zombie tokens. But again, it's not just I'm doing that scenario, I'm doing a lot of other discard outside of that, right? I have, for example, Metzelantli the Great Door, great commander card in my opinion, in the deck as well. Just looting, right? Tap, draw a card, then discard a card. So it's fitting the discard theme, which I will be doing. Remember, my commander has an ability that gives me flashback from the graveyard, so it's very likely that I can just chuck something in my graveyard that I can get back later with my commander. But also pay for, tap, transform Metzelantli the Great Door, activate only if there are 4 more permanent types among cards in your graveyard. So of course, in this deck, creature, no problem. Artifacts, not really a problem. I'm self-milling, right? The hardest for me was enchantment. I actually ended up throwing a couple of enchantments in this deck that I didn't have before just so I could flip this over. And the reason why I want to flip it over so badly is because, again, I can really go off once that is the case. And I will point out that I don't really have a deck that goes off. So this is sort of my first deck that's doing that. I'm trying to widen my horizons here. So on the back, tap, add X mana of any one color or X number of permanent cards in your graveyard. Oh boy, that's going to be a lot of mana, right? And this gets extra good because I am a little bit in the untapping tapping theme. And of course, if you're tapping and untapping and also discarding, there's a card that really plays into both of those strategies, which is Mind Over Matter. 2 blue, 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 blue. That's a whole lot of blue. Enchantment. Discard a card, tap or untap target artifact, creature, or land. And of course, this card most infamous from the Tolarian Academy deck, where tapping or untapping one thing isn't great, especially if you have to discard a card, unless that thing is something super powerful. And I guess this is a little bit of a take on the Tolarian Academy deck because that's what I'm doing here, right? The core is my Tolarian Academy, where I can tap it for 30 mana and then do a whole bunch of things, refill my hand through a various couple of different ways, untap this guy and go again, right? And I can really go off on my turn if I want to. Again, with all the discarding I'm doing, Feast of Sanity can be a win con. Not quite as good as the Psychosis Crawler because it is targeted, but I'm dealing damage and gaining life. So if I'm discarding a bunch of cards to my Sphinx of Chimes, helps out a lot there. If I'm discarding a bunch of cards with my Mind Over Matter, right? I have a couple of outlets here where I can just discard my entire hand. That's why the Echoing Return and the Secret Salvage work particularly good. I mean, really at the end of the day here, I guess I'm in a discard theme. Because what I found when I was building this deck is, okay, I'm putting 20 or 30 persistent petitioners in my hand. Now what am I going to do? I guess I could just cast them all? It doesn't seem very great. And likely I'm not going to have the mana to do so. So I thought, okay, well, I could just discard them to all these other effects. And I started finding these other effects that happened to work really good with what I was doing. And once I start discarding them, now I want more benefits, right? This is certainly a deck that I want to have like 2 or 3 or even 4 pieces in play before I start doing my thing, which I don't have a deck like that. It certainly can be effective. I don't love the fact that sometimes my deck can spin the wheels. I have played this deck enough though that it works out regardless of whether I get specific pieces in place. I have done it in a way so that I have enough backups for the plan that I have. Like, so for example, Strands of Night, funny old enchantment card I threw in the deck. Again, I needed more enchantments so that I could flip over my Metzelantli. 2 black, black enchantment, pay 2 black, pay 2 life, sacrifice a swamp, put target creature card from your graveyard onto the battlefield. So once I mill my half my library or most of my library, my Dralnu, of course, can get all the instants and sorceries, but I want something that can get creatures. And really, this is one of the best ways to repeatedly get creatures out of your graveyard. I mean, I got to sacrifice a swamp, but I got like 3 or 4 in play. I can really go to town with this guy, right? And get all those really powerful creatures out of my graveyard. Also, if I happen to mill my Sphinx of Chimes or some really important creature, again, another issue I ran into, I want to be able to get it back out again. Boneyard Mycodrax, right? I ended up throwing that in the deck. There's a creature that wants to be in the graveyard. I can very easily chuck it there with my Auric Lore Mage. Boneyard Mycodrax's power and toughness are each equal to the number of other creature cards in your graveyard and has scavenge 4 and a black. So if this guy's in my graveyard, I plan on having a ton of creatures in my graveyard. I can just turn my Sphinx of Chimes into a giant flying creature, right? this can very easily put 20 counters on my Sphinx of Chimes, and now I can just start smashing my opponents with that, right? So there is a lot of outs here. I didn't put myself in a box. I left myself a lot of other options. Psychic Spiral is a really great one. In particular, it's a really great one, and you should always have effects like this in your deck if you're self-milling in case you run into that scenario. Even if you're doing the Labman thing, someone swords your Labman, now what are you going to do, right? I also have Campfire, which will do the same thing. I mean, this puts my commander into my hand, but it also shuffles my graveyard into my library. Psychic Spiral is particularly good here because it actually can be a win as well. For blue, instant, shuffle all cards from your grave into your library. So once I've milled like 90% of my library and I'm worried about drawing out, I can shuffle back in if I want to. Target player puts that many cards from the top of their library into their graveyard. So I can have 60 cards in my graveyard, shuffle it all back in, and have whatever opponent mill 60 cards, and I can actually get the mill win here. Don't forget, I do have a bunch of persistent petitioners in the deck. Typically are going to be used for me, but I can get the mill win here, right? So I can have my opponent mill 60 cards with Psychic Spiral and then finish them off with my persistent petitioners by having them mill their final 10 or 12 cards, right? So the mill win is a possibility here as well. This is a very unique and interesting deck, and again, very much the method 2, where I had the idea for the deck. Man, I went in a bunch of different directions here. The idea was I wanted to have a same name deck. Then I settled on Persistent Petitioners as the same name card I was going to use. And by the way, I had actually considered doing both Shadowborn Apostles and Persistent Petitioners in the deck, and I realized I didn't really need to do that because I wanted mostly the same card there. I put all the same name stuff in there. Then I realized I had a very full hand at a lot of times, so I started to do the discard theme, which also kind of fit. It all really fit together really nicely, and obviously I had thought about a couple of different commanders that might work in the deck. Eventually I decided on Dralnu because I just liked the idea of being able to use the cards that I am milling into my own graveyard, and also with Echoing Return and Secret Salvage being really important cards in the deck, I can now reuse them from my graveyard if I happen to mill them myself, right? So that's why Dralnu, but obviously, if you're at all interested in this deck, I will throw the deck list in the description, and you can very easily swap out commanders with whichever one you think fits best. I like Dralnu. I'll just throw out Ghost out there, Ghost of Ramirez de Prieto. Love that commander. That is also one that works really, really well. I have it in the 99 of this deck, and it works phenomenally. In fact, in a Persistent Petitioners decks in general, Ghost of Ramirez de Prieto is a great fit because, of course, the first ability there, just pay 1, tap, target player puts the top card of the library in your graveyard. You just do that to yourself, and it becomes 1 mana tap draw card, right? Because I just mill the top card of my library, then attack with my Ghost and put that card into my hand. So works really nicely there, and whatever black partner you want with your Ghost, you could very easily do. I almost went with that. I eventually decided on Dralnu, maybe a little bit of nostalgia there and stuff like that as well. This is my newest deck in paper. I'm super excited to play with it. As of recording this video, I have not played with this deck yet together in paper. As I showed you, I don't even have it all together in paper. Hopefully by the time you guys are watching this video, I will have played with it, and I will be enjoying it as much as I did when I was playtesting it online, which I did an absolute ton. That is my newest deck. Again, stay tuned. Maybe not my very next video, but for sure next week I will be doing all-encompassing personal decks video talking about all my other decks. Again, I wanted to get as much out of the way as I could before I did that video because it's already going to be over an hour long. Stay tuned for that. That is it for today, though, and thanks for tuning in.